everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new. My name is Kristen, this is my booktube, and in today's video we're going to be doing something that is very different from anything that I've done on this channel before. So I had a reading vlog initially planned for this week. I finished Crown of Midnight, cheers for me, thank you. And I made a whole reading vlog about it with a little bit of artsy footage put in of me painting a painting for my friend. And I had that all filmed in my editing software, like basically ready to go for this week. However, there was some news that broke on Twitter earlier this week that has just been consuming me in a rage-filled way. And I need to talk about it with you all. So you may or may not have heard, but I found out on Twitter that Netflix announced recently that they are going to be doing a modernized retelling of the Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of excited when this was announced. I am a fan of modernizations, of retellings. I do genuinely enjoy them when they're done well. The problem is, a lot of times they aren't done well. So I was pretty excited when I first saw this article going around on Twitter, until I saw people starting to react to it. And then I read the article, and my feelings changed quite quickly. So the series is supposed to be called The Greys. It is, quote, a contemporary take on the Oscar Wilde classic about our fascination with eternal youth set against the backdrop of the modern beauty industry. In a twist on the Gothic novel, the series revolves around siblings Basil and Dorian Gray. So just from that short description, it already tells us that one, they've changed Dorian's name to Doran, and because of that, people are speculating that it is a gender-bent version where Dorian is actually a woman. Two, if Dorian is a woman in this adaptation, putting her in the beauty industry and making her obsessed with being eternally youthful is not exactly the most unique vantage point to take with this. Like making a story about a woman who is obsessed with being eternally youthful and is in the beauty industry. Groundbreaking, you know? I just don't understand changing a classic and modernizing it to make it a cliche like that. I don't like that. I think it's a little weird. And thing that is causing the most outrage with this very short article is the fact that they made Basil and Dorian siblings. So even with just like a couple paragraphs, this article sent book Twitter into a tizzy. People were very upset, rightfully so, about all of these changes, but specifically the one that makes Basil and Dorian siblings, because their relationship in the original novel is homosexual. There is male-on-male love in the story, and it's obvious. You don't have to know a lot about the story or know a lot about Oscar Wilde to know that there are homosexual themes in The Picture of Dorian Gray. So when I saw that the other day and I actually read it, in my mind I was like, this can't be right. Like, this has to be bad info, and they're gonna come out with another article soon debunking all of this and giving us what the actual story is about. And then crickets. There was nothing else that came out from Netflix after this that I saw, at least up to this point that I'm recording this. So because this is the way that their TV series is actually shaping up to be, at least from what it seems, I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to tell you exactly why myself and so many people on the internet are upset about this little information that we have about this retelling so far, because, oh my god, it's already so bad. It's already missing the mark so hard. I think this is a record time, honestly, for Netflix to disappoint a fan base, to be quite honest. Like, the series isn't even out yet, and already, like, the people who love The Picture of Dorian Gray are mad about it. So honestly, kind of impressive. If Netflix is trying to speed run alienating entire fan bases, they're doing a great job of that, honestly, because they're just getting faster and faster with each retelling and reimagination that they do. So this is going to be my first venture into the essay/commentary YouTube space. So my apologies if it is a bit long-winded, but we have a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to not be a long-winded historian and just give you all of the context of everything that is involved in the lore surrounding The Picture of Dorian Gray, but we have a lot to cover, so we need to go ahead and just jump in and get started. So before I even started this YouTube channel, I was once a history graduate student. I got my master's degree in modern history in 2018, where my master's dissertation focused on the policing and prosecution of crime and the shifting ideals of masculinity in Victorian London. On top of that, I was also slated to start a PhD in 2021, where my research focus for my my thesis would have been the policing and prosecution of homosexuality in Victorian London, specifically focusing on cases like Oscar Wilde's in 1895. I have done extensive research on the topic of the policing and prosecution of homosexuality in this era. I've done a lot of research on Oscar Wilde's trial. I've read The Picture of Dorian Gray and thought about it within the historical context of the era in which it was written. The Picture of Dorian Gray didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. It existed in the context of all that surrounded it and all that came before it, literally. And I need to talk about this or else I will lose my mind. So, without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump on into the real meat of this video. Okay, so I don't know about y'all, but it's been a while since I've read The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's been at least like 4 years. And there are probably people watching this video right now that have not read The Picture of Dorian Gray, that do not want to read The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I don't blame you, but I want us all to be on the same page so that you know what's going on and why I'm so mad. So I'm going to give you a brief Cliff Notes version of what happens in The Picture of Dorian Gray. And it'll be enough for you to understand where I'm coming from with my frustration. So if you haven't already, go ahead and grab yourself a little beverage and let's just dive on in. So The Picture of Dorian Gray was initially published in a newspaper as a short story, or maybe it was a magazine. One of those two. In any case, it was initially published as a short story, as so many authors used to do in that period. The Sherlock Holmes stories were published in newspapers. There were a bunch of other like creepy, scary stories in newspapers called penny dreadfuls, things like that. So it's important to keep in mind that when The Picture of Dorian Gray as a novel came out, it had already been published in a previous edition before that. And the first edition of The Picture of Dorian Gray was way more homoerotic than the actual novel ever ended up being. And that is specifically because when he published the short story in magazine form, it was very controversial because of the homoerotic themes within the story. So when he published the full novel, he had to do significant revisions, take out a lot of the passages that were blatantly about Basil's love for Dorian and how Dorian is Basil's muse. So that is very important context that we will come back to a little bit later. But I needed you to know that up front because it is important for how this novel came about, why it is the way it is, and how it impacts Oscar Wilde at the end of his life. So the full novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, was published in 1891, and it centers on Basil, who is an artist, and this painting that he does of Dorian Gray. Dorian is described as a very beautiful man, and Basil's not immune to it. He falls for his beauty. Dorian ends up meeting a man named Lord Henry Wotton, I think is how you say his name. It's like Wotton. Henry, we'll just call him Henry. Dorian meets Henry through Basil, and Henry is this nobleman who lives this very hedonistic lifestyle and thinks that like the point of life is to experience as much pleasure and sensuality as possible. And he is a big influence on Dorian, and Dorian decides that he wants that life too. Dorian decides to sell his soul so that he can live out this hedonistic life of debauchery without any repercussions physically. His wish is then granted, and not only does his portrait age in his place, but it also absorbs any sinful actions that he does and displays them onto the painting itself. That's one part of the story that is immediately missing from the description of the TV show. They make it seem like it's just about vanity, and it's way more than that with Dorian, okay? Dorian is a very complex character, and he is low-key, like, not a good guy. Like, he is actively seeking a way to be a terrible person without any repercussions. And so now that he does not have to deal with any of the ramifications of his actions, he heads full force down this morally corrupt path. And while he is on this downward spiral, he ends up meeting this working-class actress named Sybil Vane. He also proposes marriage to her very quickly. And Sybil is like head over heels for him. She tells her brother about it, and she even nicknames him Prince Charming. He's this wealthy man that is going to sweep her out of the slums of London and give her a better life. Meanwhile, her brother James sees right through Dorian, and he threatens to kill him if he does anything to hurt his sister. Now, Dorian does genuinely think that Sybil is a talented actress, and he ends up taking Basil and Henry to one of her performances. But because he is in the audience, it throws Sybil off off her game, and she does not perform very well. This embarrasses Dorian, and he takes it basically as a personal affront, and he very coldly and callously breaks up with her. I have a quote from him written down as saying, "Without your talent, I'm no longer interested in you." Yeah, so basically he got the ick and he dumped his fiance in the most callous way that he possibly could. Like, if they would have had cell phones at this time, I'm pretty sure Dorian would have just broken up with her over like a quick text message or something. Like, he's not good. As a result, Sybil is understandably very distraught over this. She thought that she was going to marry this well-off, wealthy man that was in love with her, and then just like that, he decided he's not into her anymore. And then when Dorian returns home and he looks at the painting now has a cruel and ugly sneer on it. So, our first mark on this painting has nothing to do with him aging at all. It has to do with him being needlessly cruel to someone who thought that he loved them. This is the point, at least where I was reading it, where it's clear that, like, the point of the story is that he's beautiful on the outside, but he is ugly on the inside because of what a horrible person he is throughout most of this book. And the portrait is supposed to reflect who he really is. Not just the fact that he's aging. It's not just a way for him to stay young and beautiful forever. The point is that this painting physically displays how horribly he acts to the people around him. In addition to him aging, like, it's really just making the outside match the inside, you know? At least that was my interpretation of it when I read the book. He is 100% a vain man, but he is also willingly traveling down this road of moral corruption. And that is really how the portrait gets so ugly so quickly, because it is showing who Dorian is based on his actions. It is making the portrait as ugly as his soul is. So that's the first of many marks that end up marring the portrait. Dorian then realizes that he was overly callous with Sybil. He was probably a little too mean to her. So he decides to go back and try to apologize to her. But he is too late because his words hit their mark and Sybil ended up taking her own life because of the things that he said to her. And instead of trying to take this as a sign that he needs to be a better person, that he needs to treat people more kindly, he essentially takes it as a challenge, and he ends up going full force into this hedonistic lifestyle where, like, lust, sensuality, and beauty are the only things that really matter to him. He then decides to lock up the portrait where no one in his staff can see it, and the next 18 years he just goes buck wild while watching every single sin he commits marked onto the portrait. In these 18 years, Basil does not give up on Dorian. Dorian is Basil's muse. Basil cares very deeply about Dorian, and he is concerned from him from the very beginning, from what I remember, about this life that he's choosing to lead. And Basil finally decides to go to Dorian's house and try to confront him about it. Dorian decides to show him the portrait for some reason. I don't remember exactly why he does that, but he does. He shows Basil his ugly ass portrait, and Basil doesn't even recognize it as his own painting. The only way that he knows that it is the painting that he did of Dorian is because of his signature at the bottom, and then he freaks out, as you would. I feel like if I painted something for one of my friends and they're like, come look at it, and it's like morphed into some like demonic version of the painting that I did, I think I would freak out too. I would panic. I'd be like, what the hell is going on here? What happened? So after 20 years of Dorian gallivanting about and just being a horrible person, the portrait's now unrecognizable. So upon seeing the portrait, Basil is absolutely horrified, and Basil begs Dorian to seek salvation, to right his soul, and to turn his life around, essentially. And instead of like actually listening to Basil and taking in what someone who cares for him has to say, Dorian basically becomes filled with rage and ends up blaming Basil for painting the portrait in the first place. He doesn't take any responsibility for his own actions that marred the portrait, or, you know, his action to sell his soul and like set his life on this hedonistic path. He doesn't take credit for any of that. Everything that happens to Dorian is someone else's fault. I think we all know people like that. Some things don't change, okay? People still are people at the end of the day. And so he blames Basil for creating the portrait in the first place and ends up murdering him in his fit of rage. And of course, this murder adds yet another mark to the portrait, making it even uglier than before. So to clean up his mess, now that he's murdering people, Dorian commits another crime, and he ends up blackmailing one of his old friends, who is a chemist, to get rid of the body. And said friend also ends up taking their life later in the story. So Dorian's just racking up these kills. Like, whether he directly caused them to take their own life or he actually took the life himself, he has 3 now that are explicitly mentioned in this book under his belt. So once again, it's a little more than he's just a vain person, okay? He's out here murdering people. So after the body is dealt with and Dorian has caused yet another person to take their own life, Dorian decides that it's a good idea for him to go to an opium den to try to escape his guilt. But unbeknownst to him, James Vane is also at this opium den. If you remember, James Vane is the brother of Sybil Vane, who said that he would murder Dorian if he did anything to hurt his sister. I think causing her suicide is enough. And James has not forgotten about it. James has spent the last 20 years trying to track down Dorian. The problem is that James never knew Dorian's real name. Because Sybil always just called her Prince Charming, he never knew what Dorian's actual name was. You know, in all of the opium dens and all of the towns and all of the world, he walks into mine kind of shit, you know? So James ends up overhearing someone else at the opium den refer to Dorian as Prince Charming, and he confronts him. And while he basically has him like pinned against the wall, Dorian is able to weasel his way out of it by saying like, I'm clearly too young to be the guy that you're looking for. Like, look at me, I'm so young. I can't be the one who was engaged to your sister. Look at me, I'm just a baby. And it worked. James let him go because he was like, you know what, you're so right. And so Dorian gets away, basically scot-free on that encounter. So James is then informed by someone else that the man he was talking to was in fact Dorian Gray, the one that his sister was engaged to. He just, for some reason, hasn't aged in 20 years. So now that James knows who Prince Charming actually is, he has a name to go with the face, he begins to stalk Dorian around London. And this also causes Dorian to become more and more paranoid as well. When Dorian goes on a hunting trip, James also follows him and kind of trails them in the woods and actually ends up getting shot by one of the hunters by accident. We'll go ahead and add a 4th body to Dorian's body count at this point because I'm counting James as a casualty of Dorian's because it's all his fault as far as I'm concerned. So at this point in the story, Dorian tells Henry that he doesn't really want to live this sinful lifestyle anymore. He wants to turn his life around and he wants to do better. And as his first act of kindness, he decides not to break up with his girlfriend like he did with Sybil. Wow, man of the year right there, ladies and gents. But okay, whatever. And his hope in doing that is that maybe if he can be a good person and do righteous things in his life, he can undo the damage that he has caused to his portrait and by extension to himself. However, when he gets home and he looks at the portrait again, it has become even uglier because his motives weren't coming from the right place. Even in his quote good actions, he's acting in his own self-interest, not out of the goodness of his heart. And Dorian doesn't see it like that. He basically takes this as a sign that he's a lost cause and that the only way that he can absolve himself is to destroy the painting and by extension the evidence of all of the crimes that he's committed. At least that's how it works in his mind. In yet another fit of rage, Dorian takes the same knife that he stabbed Basil with and he stabs his own portrait. His servants awaken to a scream. When they rush to the room where they hear it coming from, the door is locked from the inside. And when the cops enter the room, they find a withered and decrepit old man on the floor who had been stabbed in the heart. The only way they are able to identify the man as Dorian is by the jewelry that he is wearing, while the portrait is lying on the floor next to him, torn but beautiful as the day it was painted. And that's how the Picture of Dorian Gray ends, okay? So now that we have the context of what the Picture of Dorian Gray is actually about, we also need to get a little bit into the historical context as well. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson. I promise to make it as fun and interesting as possible. I promise I won't just read you my PhD proposal on this research topic. Could you imagine though if you just clicked on this video and then it was just like me reading a research proposal? Like, throughout my doctoral studies, I aim to develop a thesis that focuses on the shifting ideals of masculinity, the boundaries of privacy, and the parliamentary legislation in relation to the policing and prosecution of crime in Victorian and Edwardian England. Like, can you imagine if I did that? That would be so boring. Like, none of you want me doing that. So now that we talked about the Picture of Dorian Gray, we need to talk a little bit about who Oscar Wilde is as well. So in case you're unaware, Oscar Wilde was a very prominent author in the Victorian period. He was born in Ireland and then he moved to London, I believe after college, to make a name for himself as an author and a playwright. With one of his more famous plays being The Importance of Being Earnest, and his only novel being The Picture of Dorian Gray. So I mentioned a bit earlier how The Picture of Dorian Gray was initially a short story in a magazine. And when it was first printed in short story form, it was so controversial that the popular bookseller W.H. Smith, which is still around today in the UK, pulled every single copy of that magazine from their newsstands around the city. It was an offensive text at the time specifically because of the homosexual themes throughout the story, which in turn led to the further obscurement of themes in the 1891 novel version because of all of the editing that Oscar Wilde had to do. The full novel had lengthy passages and exchanges between characters revolving around the nature of the relationship between Basil and Dorian, completely removed. This is an example of just one passage that I quickly found via the Harvard University Press that was redacted. So it says, "Tell me more about Dorian Gray. How often do you see him?" "Every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. Of course, sometimes it's only for a few minutes, but a few minutes with someone worships mean a great deal." "But you don't really worship him." "I do." "How extraordinary. I thought you would never care for anything but your painting, your art." "I should say, art does sound better, doesn't it?" "He is all my art to me now. Sometimes I think, Harry, that there are only two eras of any importance in the history of the world. The first is the appearance of a new medium for art. The second is the appearance of a new personality for art also. What the invention of oil painting was to the Venetians, the face of Antinos was to the late Greek sculptor, and the face of Dorian Gray will someday be to me. It is not merely that I paint from him, draw from him, model from him. Of course I have done all that. He has stood as Paris in dainty armor, and as Adonis with the huntsman's cloak and polished boar spear, crowned with heavy lotus blossoms. He has sat on the prow of Adrian's barge, looking into the green, turbid Nile. He has leaned over the still pool of some Greek woodland and seen the water's silent silver, the wonder of his own beauty. But he is much more to me than that. I won't tell you that I am dissatisfied with what I have done of him, or that his beauty is such that art cannot express. There is nothing that art cannot express. And I know that the work I have done since I met Dorian Gray is good work, is the best work of my life. I see things differently. I think of them differently. I can now recreate life in a way that was once hidden from me before. A dream of form in days of thought. Who is it who says that? I forget. But it is what Dorian Gray has been to me. The mere visible presence of this lad, for he seems to be a little more than a lad, though he is really over 20, is merely visible presence. Ah, I wonder, can you realize all that means? Harry, if you only knew what Dorian Gray is to me, you would remember that landscape of mine, for which Agnew offered me such a huge price, but which I could not part with. It is one of the best things I have ever done. And why is it so? Because while I was painting it, Dorian Gray sat beside me. Passages like that were enough to cause huge moral outrage in the Victorian era. If this was a man speaking about a woman, it wouldn't have been nearly as big of a deal. But it is because it is a male character talking about another male character that it was so offensive and had to be completely taken out of the novel when the full book was published. And even though it was taken out of the full novel, passages like this were used against Oscar Wilde in his own court case over being a homosexual man when he was tried for gross indecency. Literally on his Wikipedia page, there are 3 things listed that he is famous for, and one of the 3 is his trial and conviction for being a gay man. This is something that is inherent in the popular memory of who Oscar Wilde is. It is his legacy, and it is an important legacy because of what it means for the wider struggle for LGBTQ rights and the wider history of queerness in general in the UK. So if you know anything about Oscar Wilde, you would know that this book is inherently tied to not only Oscar Wilde being a gay man, but it's literally part of what got him convicted. So speaking of his trial and conviction, let's talk a little bit about that as well. So like I said, the novel version of The Picture of Dorian Gray came out in 1891. His trial didn't happen for another 4 years. So even though it was used against him in a court case, he was not arrested for that book. In fact, at the time of his trial in 1895, he was fairly popular. The Importance of Being Earnest had just released, and it was very successful. And it seemed like everything was going fairly well for Oscar Wilde at this point in time, at least. But between February 1895, pretty much at the height of his career, by the time June rolls around, he is convicted and being sent to prison. So how did all of that happen? You may be wondering. I'm here to tell you. So Oscar Wilde did have a wife and family, but he also had his male relationships as well. And while he did have a few relationships with other men, the main one that ended up being the catalyst for what ultimately ended up being his downfall was his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. Lord Alfred Douglas was also a poet. He and Oscar Wilde would often work together and kind of copy edit each other's works. They would read over each other's poems, offer suggestions, things like that. And they also wrote poems for each other. And as would be expected with a name like Lord Alfred Douglas, he is part of the peerage in England. And Lord Alfred Douglas was in line to be the next Marquis of Queensberry, a position that was at the time held by his father. And his father ended up finding out about their relationship, and he's mad, so he ends up leaving what is known as a calling card. It's kind of like a Victorian version of a voicemail. You would just kind of show up at someone's house or a club that they were a member at, and you would kind of leave a business card looking thing that had your name on it and a message for them. So Queensberry ended up taking a calling card up to a club that Oscar Wilde was a member of, leaving this calling card that accused Oscar Wilde of being a sodomite. Wilde then decided, with the input of Lord Douglas himself, to sue Queensberry for libel. Little armchair historian here, probably not the best idea as a gay man to sue another man for libel for calling you a gay man. Hindsight's 20/20 though, and he did it anyway. So Oscar Wilde ended up suing the Marquis of Queensberry for libel. However, the trial did not go in his favor. Queensberry was found not guilty when what was being produced in evidence were some of the love poems that he and Douglas had written back and forth. They had gotten witnesses from the various brothels around London to testify against Oscar Wilde. And so this court case did not go his way. Queensberry was found not guilty. And because of the evidence that came to light in this libel trial, the government then thought that they had enough evidence to try him for gross indecency under the 1885 Criminal Amendment Act. So this Criminal Amendment Act, like many acts that are passed by politicians even today, had a lot of different laws wrapped up into it. The act was passed by a member of parliament named Henry Ladbrochet, and I did a lot of research onto Henry Ladbrochet when I did my master's dissertation because he was a staunch opponent of domestic violence in the Victorian era. On top of that, he was also very homophobic, so homophobic, basically reducing homosexual men down to animalistic imagery. And he claimed that it posed a threat to the city and specifically the women in the city, which I don't fully understand how gay men are causing safety issues for women in the city, especially when in my own research, the stuff that men would do to their wives and just get away with it because it wasn't explicitly against the law, far more safety concern for women than anything gay men ever did in the thousands of court cases that I have combed through, okay? But that's beside the point. We're not here to get mad at Victorian homophobia. Ladbrochet basically took it upon himself to cleanse the city of moral corruption, and this essentially just means ridding the streets of poor people, gay people, drunk people, and violent men in general. And when I say this bill made it easier to prosecute homosexual men, it did it in several different ways. One of the main overarching themes within this act that made it easier to prosecute both domestic violence cases and homosexual men is the fact that it extended the reach of the law into the privacy of the home for I think the first time, if I remember correctly. It's been like 6 years since I've looked into any of these laws, so don't quote me specifically, but I'm going off of the gist of what I remember when I was in academia, okay? Now, while this was good for women who were experiencing domestic violence, it is not good for homosexual men. Because now all that has to happen is someone just has to see an inkling of a homosexual act, whether it be on the street or in the home. If someone witnesses any sort of homosexual act or something that can be construed as homosexual tendencies, you ran the risk of being imprisoned. The other way that this bill made it easier to prosecute homosexual men is the fact that it gave a very vague description of what gross indecency constitutes. And they did that on purpose. Gross indecency was purposely a term that was so vague that they could apply it to basically anything short of actual sex. The other existing crimes for homosexuality, buggery/sodomy, had very specific definitions for them and very heavy punishments that went with them. If you were convicted of sodomy or buggery in the Victorian period, the punishment was death. This was a way to imprison gay men without having to prove that any intercourse had ever taken place. So really what this meant was that you just had to seem a little too gay or seem a little too eccentric even, and you could be the center of an investigation and a trial for gross indecency. And this is exactly what happened to Oscar Wilde, because when he sued for libel and Queensberry's lawyers put forward evidence that no, what Queensberry said is true and Oscar Wilde is actually a gay man. Once that is presented into the court of law, it is on the record. So all they had to do was just file a new court case. And then less than like a month or two later, Oscar Wilde was back in court defending himself once again for being a gay man. When I looked up this court case on the Old Bailey, the verdict for the Queensberry case read, "Not guilty," and put in a plea of justification stating that the contents of the alleged libel be true in substance and in fact, and that it was published for the profit of the public. Losing this libel case left Oscar Wilde bankrupt. So not only has he lost all of his money at this point, he now has to turn around and be prosecuted himself for gross indecency, where his works were used against him in court. And the first time that they put forward the case, they basically had a hung jury. The jury couldn't come to an agreement of whether he should be guilty or not. And then they had another trial and he was found guilty on May 20th, 1895 of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years hard labor, which was the maximum punishment for gross indecency at the time. And the judge saying that he didn't feel like it was adequate enough and that this was the worst case that he ever tried, which that's pretty crazy. To me, at least, knowing the kind of court cases that were around in the Victorian period, I'm pretty sure I've read more gruesome court cases than this in just the sampling that I did of domestic violence court cases. But you know what? To each their own, I guess, Once again, I'm not here to argue with Victorian homophobia because, I don't think I'm mentally strong enough for that battle. I can't remember what newspaper it was in, but I remember reading newspaper coverage of the Oscar Wilde trial and when the verdict was handed down. The newspaper reporter that wrote the article talked about how Oscar Wilde opened his mouth as if he was going to speak and then just let out a silent cry before he was ushered away back to his prison cell. Okay, I found the Oscar Wilde trial bit that I was talking about. It is very blurry. This newspaper that I'm reading out of, the scan of it is absolutely atrocious. It is so blurry, but it is all that I have to go on. So I will read you the part that I was talking about right now. So this is when the verdict was handed down on Oscar Wilde, and this was his reaction to hearing that he was found guilty. Wilde, on hearing his sentence, raised his arm and gazed forward with a despairing look. As though he was about to speak, his mouth moved, but all that could be heard was a hollow cry. "Can't I say anything?" The warders gently motioned him back, and he stepped towards the stairs. Just before reaching them, however, he turned his horror-stricken face once more towards the court and seemed to desire to say something. This was interrupted by him being handed down to the cells below. below. It's accounts like that really make you realize how horrifying it must have been to have that happen to you. And it really goes to show that, like, no matter how famous someone was in this time period or how beloved some of their works were, they were not immune to being prosecuted for their sexuality. He ended up serving his 2 years of hard labor, and after he got out of prison, he moved to Paris, where he ended up passing away at the age of 45. And like, when I say that this was a huge trial, it was absolutely a massive trial. People like to act like true crime and the fascination with court cases and crimes that are committed is like a new phenomenon in the age of like documentaries and podcasts and things like that, but it's definitely not. People have been sensationalizing court cases and stuff since the courts were invented, okay? Like, it is not new. It may look a little different, like, obviously they didn't have TVs and podcasts in the 1890s, but what they did have were newspapers. And that was the key form of entertainment at the time. They would pack into the galleries of the courthouses, and if they didn't fit inside, they would stand outside to try to catch a glimpse of whoever was being tried at the time. And then after the court case had adjourned, there were daily copies of newspapers that gave play-by-play accounts of what had occurred in the courtroom the day prior. So they had these newspapers that were coming out every day to keep them up to date about what was happening with the most pressing cases of the time. You would have every major newspaper reporting on the Oscar Wilde case. They would be selling copies every day. If you couldn't afford to buy your own copy, they had ones that you could rent for a couple hours just so you could read through the news for the day. And if you couldn't read, if you were illiterate, there were illustrated newspapers as well, so that literally, no matter what your reading level is, no matter what your wealth status is, newspapers were accessible by pretty much everyone in English society. And it was normal to sensationalize the court cases and the proceedings and reactions and things. I mean, if you think about it, there's no TV, no social media, no emails to keep you up to date on what's going on. So like, newspapers were pretty much it as far as like the way that current events traveled. People have always had what I like to call a fascination with the abomination. Like, don't even get me started on the Jack the Ripper mania of the 1880s. Even though I studied crime in the Victorian era, I specifically like avoided that area because it's so oversaturated. There are so many armchair experts even today. So all of this to say that Oscar Wilde's trial was a very public spectacle. And that, in combination with him being basically at the height of his fame when he went on trial, resulted in this becoming one of the most notorious cases of the 19th century, I would argue. Definitely one of the most prominent cases in LGBTQ history in the UK, for sure. This is one book where the context is absolutely necessary. It was written in a period of history where you could be imprisoned and serve hard labor if someone even thought you were gay. So with that context in mind, writing The Picture of Dorian Gray with even subtle homosexual themes to it was so daring. It was a very risky thing to do. And Oscar Wilde was even quoted in saying that he really put himself into The Picture of Dorian Gray, how different characters represent different sides of him. So in a time period and place where having your name explicitly written on a work of homosexual fiction could potentially be enough to end your career and even maybe your life, it's no wonder the examples that we do have of homoerotic fiction in the Victorian era are so subtle. It's a way to be able to express yourself and who you are while still trying to self-preserve and survive. Just because the queerness of the story is more subdued does not mean that it is not important. It is so important, especially in a book like The Picture of Dorian Gray. And that's where my main issue with this Netflix adaptation lies. We can sit here and talk more about the misinterpretation of what the painting actually represents, or we could talk about the potential gender-bending side of this adaptation, but that's not nearly as deplorable to me as the queer erasure that comes with making Basil and Dorian siblings in this series. I also honestly find this quite disrespectful, because this action goes so far beyond Oscar Wilde and the Picture of Dorian Gray in general, because there are so many queer people in history that have suffered the same, if not worse, fates for being who they are. And I think in general, we need to do a better job of learning about queer histories that predate the 1960s, because yes, homophobia in the 60s was bad, and there are reasons why things like Stonewall happened, but it's also important to understand that the things that were happening in the 60s did not happen in a vacuum, and that queer people didn't just start existing in the mid 20th century. There were gay people in the 1860s, in the 1760s, in the 1660s, as far back as you can go. So when you erase some of the few examples that we have in literature of queer love and queer representation, it's just adding to the historical erasure of the LGBTQ people in those time periods as well. And that's why I get so upset about it. Because rather than making a version of the Greys that completely takes out those queer themes, I would think that in the year 2024, they would be leaning into those and really showing people that this story is important in queer history. And I think that it would be so much better honored if they leaned more into those themes. This visibility is so important when we talk about LGBTQ history, because these aren't histories that are carefully curated. In fact, they're histories that were largely attempted to be completely covered up and erased from the narrative. When I was researching for my PhD proposal, I read the memoirs of a poet named John Addington Symonds, and he ended up living his entire life as a closeted gay man. But while he was alive, he wrote these really heartbreaking memoirs about him struggling with his sexuality in the 1800s. And he bounces back and forth from thinking things like, you know, what is wrong with me? Why am I this way? How can I fix myself? And then he goes back to saying things like, but how can a love this pure feel so wrong? And he talks about how in writing his honest memoirs, he found that there are so many more homosexual men than he ever thought that there were. And I do own his memoirs, and I wanted to read you an excerpt out of them to just kind of give you a bit of perspective from someone who was struggling with their sexuality at the time. So this is towards the end of the memoirs, and he says, I did not want more, indeed, than blameless proximity of his pure person. Odd and unnatural as this may seem to those who cannot understand man's love for man, or to those who have made their minds up that such love must be brutal, I have never enjoyed a more sense-soothing and more elevated pleasure than I had with him, sex being nowhere, drowned and absorbed in love, which was itself so spiritually sensual that the needs of the body disappeared and were forgotten. Words fail me when I try to describe a relation which had much of hazardous, but which the respective nature of the men concerned made natural and right. He accepted me for what I was, and I asked nothing else except his proximity. It was enough for me to be with him. Alas, while writing this, I must perforce lay the pen aside and think how desolate these conditions under which men constituted like me live and love. The utmost we dare expect is tolerance, acceptance, concession to our inclinations, gratitude for our goodwill and benefits, respect for our courtesy and self-control. The best we obtain is friendship. Love for love we cannot get. Though John Addington Symonds did pass away before the Oscar Wilde trial, visibility like this into the thoughts and feelings of a homosexual man in the Victorian period are so important. This memoir itself was not even published until like 70 years after Symonds had passed away. These histories are veiled and hidden, as the memoirs were for so many years. They were exchanged in safe spaces, left behind to people who they thought they could trust. And if I remember right, I think that even John Addington Symonds requested that at least 50 years pass between his passing and the publishing of these memoirs, so that his immediate family wouldn't receive negative backlash for being related to him, essentially. To be publicly out as a gay man in the Victorian period was essentially a death sentence. So precautions had to be taken. Things had to be more subtle. And the queerness of artists like Oscar Wilde and John Addington Symonds can be found in the details if you know where to look. They may not be as blatantly obvious as modern queer romances are, purely as a survival function. And I think that this feeling is summed up best in this quote by John Addington Symonds. My object is known to myself, but it is not one that I care to disclose in set phrases. Someone, peradventure, will discover it. and if he is a friend, will shed perhaps a tear at the thought of what these lines have cost me. And I think that sums up what gets lost here. In doing an adaptation in this way, Netflix is completely erasing what writing those lines cost Oscar Wilde in the long run. As a poet, Oscar Wilde used his work as a form of self-expression. And though by our modern standards, The Picture of Dorian Gray doesn't seem to be overtly queer in the way that it is written, and by taking out what seems to be subtle hints towards a homosexual relationship between Basil and Dorian may seem minimal to the executives at Netflix, in doing so, they are fundamentally changing what The Picture of Dorian Gray is really about. Fundamentally changing this relationship between Basil and Dorian is not putting a modern twist onto a Gothic classic. What you do by taking that queerness out of this story is you are completely erasing the history that this novel has, the cultural impact. By doing this, Netflix is essentially erasing the queerness of the story that Wilde deliberately put in there that cost him so much. You're ignoring all of the historical context that surrounds this book. This could have been such a slam dunk for Netflix if they would have just really leaned into what makes The Picture of Dorian Gray so important historically, culturally, aesthetically. And it honestly makes me wonder, one, did these people even ever actually read this book? And two, if they did read it, did they actually understand the gravity of what is happening in the story and its context in the wider historical context of LGBTQ rights? If the answer is yes to both, then it's just blatant queer erasure and homophobia. If the answer is no to both, then it was never about making a good adaptation for The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was never about honoring the queer history inherent in the story. It was never about honoring the legacy that Oscar Wilde left behind because he was daring enough to teeter on the line of what is acceptable in Victorian society when it comes to sexuality. And if it really was never about being faithful to the original story and it was just about making a show that people will potentially watch, then this is just another in a long, long line of disappointing adaptations that focus on the wrong aspects of the shows or the stories that they're based on and end up completely missing the mark for the fans of the original work. Call me crazy, but churning out half-baked adaptations of beloved classics and contemporary fiction like Netflix has been doing for the past few years with blatant disregard to being true to the story or the morals inherent in the original work doesn't really seem like an optimal business strategy, but what do I know? I'm just a girl on the internet.